Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that haunts the edges of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. A question that most people never think to ask, because the answer is uncomfortable, because it sits in a corner of Imperial history that the scribes and High Lords of Terror would rather leave unlit, covered in dust, sealed behind a door that nobody opens. The question is this: has anything in the galaxy ever come close to actually killing the Emperor? Not wounding him in some abstract psychic sense, not challenging his plans or frustrating his designs, but genuinely, physically, existentially close to ending the life of the most powerful human being who has ever existed. The being who shaped the destiny of an entire species across tens of thousands of years, who built an empire stretching across 1,000,000 worlds. You who lit a beacon in the darkness of the warp that every soul in the Imperium depends on for survival. Most people, if they answer that question at all, point to Horus, the War Master, the arch-traitor, the beloved son who stabbed his father on the bridge of the vengeful spirit and left wounds so catastrophic that 10,000 years later, the Emperor's broken body still sits inside a golden machine just to keep breathing. And yes, Horus came closer than anything else ever has. Nobody disputes that. But Horus was also a Primarch, a demigod, a being engineered by the Emperor himself to be the finest warrior in history, then driven over the edge by the combined whispered corruption of the four Chaos gods, working in concert over years and years. Horus had the backing of ancient entities of immeasurable power, but he had corrupted half of the Emperor's most trusted sons. He had 10,000 space marines at his back when he faced his father, and he was operating under a kind of blessing from the warp that made him temporarily more powerful than he had any right to be. The deck was stacked in his favor in every way it could be stacked. What if I told you that a creature of pure, uncomplicated, joyful violence came closer to derailing everything than most people realize? Not through subtlety, not through possession or divine corruption, not through 10,000 years of scheming in the warp. What if I told you that a green-skinned alien warlord, wired by biology and ancient design to do nothing but fight and conquer and grow bigger the more battles he won, came so terrifyingly close to breaking the Emperor's Great Crusade that it forced the most powerful being in human history to step down from his flagship and personally enter the battle? And that later, 1,500 years after the Emperor was already confined to his golden prison, another creature of the same breed, grown even larger, even smarter, even more terrifyingly capable, parked a moon-sized weapon directly over Terra and came closer than anything since to ending humanity's last hope entirely. This is the story of the Orc Warbosses, who nearly killed the Emperor. This is the story of Garl Blackfang and Erlac Urg and the creature history knows only as the Beast. This is the story of the Green Tide at its most dangerous, at its most impossibly powerful, and of the extraordinary cost paid by the Imperium to hold that tide back. And it is a story that most 40,000 discussions rush past in their eagerness to get to the more famous events. The Horus heresy dominates the conversation about the Great Crusade era in a way that can make everything before it look like a prelude, like setup, like the period of peace before the storm. But that framing is misleading in a specific and important way, because the battles we are going to talk about were not peaceful. They were not simply prologue. They were, in their own right, some of the most consequential military engagements in Imperial history, fought against threats that deserved the same serious attention we give to Horus. Maybe more, in some ways. Because at least with Horus, you could have a conversation. At least Horus had reasons, however corrupted and twisted, however infected with the lies that the Chaos gods fed him. Perhaps at least Horus was once something the Emperor loved. There was something almost human in the tragedy of it, something that made the scale of the betrayal land with emotional weight. An Orc Warboss does not betray you. An Orc Warboss does not even understand the concept of betrayal. He does not scheme across decades or negotiate from hidden agendas. He does not have a plan that unfolds through misdirection. He fights, he grows, he comes. And the only question that matters, the only strategic variable that anyone on the other side has to care about, is whether they can stop him before he gets too big. That simplicity is not a weakness. It is one of the most terrifying things about them. Complexity can be anticipated, predicted, manipulated. Simplicity, when backed by sufficient scale, becomes something closer to a law of nature. Water does not plan to drown you. Gravity does not scheme to hold you down. They simply are what they are. And if you happen to be in the way, that is your problem. Orcs, at a sufficient scale, function the same way. Settle in. Take a breath. This one runs deep. Part 1. What makes an orc dangerous? Before we can understand why these particular warbosses were so terrifying, we need to understand something fundamental about what orcs are. Because most people look at a greenskin and they see something crude, something laughable, almost. The big jaws, the scrappy cobbled together weapons, the fact that their technology should by all rights not function at all. They look loud and ridiculous and more than a little chaotic. And that perception is exactly why orcs have survived everything the galaxy has thrown at them for billions of years. Because the moment you start laughing, they've already won. The truth about orcs is that they are one of the most elegantly engineered weapons ever created. Not by accident, not through evolution in any conventional sense, but by design. Long before the Imperium existed, long before humanity had even made it out of its own solar system, a species called the Old Ones, ancient, unfathomably intelligent beings who were already ancient when the stars were young, fought a war against a rival species that nearly consumed the galaxy. The Necrontyr, later the Necrons. And in fighting that war, the Old Ones needed soldiers. They needed something that could grow fast, multiply without limit, fight without fear, and survive conditions that would destroy anything else. So they made the Krork, the ancestral species from which modern orcs descend. And the Old Ones, in their wisdom or their desperation, built into the Krork a set of biological systems so efficient, so self-sustaining, and so brutally effective that 10 billion years later, those systems are still running perfectly. The Krork were the Old Ones' solution to an extinction-level threat, engineered from the ground up to function as a biological weapon that could never truly be stopped, never truly be eliminated, never truly be defeated in any permanent sense. The Old Ones looked at the Necron threat and decided that the only adequate response was to create something that was, in biological terms, functionally immortal as a species. They succeeded beyond any measure that could be called comfortable. An orc is not simply an animal, it is a symbiosis of two completely different organisms. One side animal, one side fungal, fused together at a genetic level into something that takes the best qualities of both and combines them into a creature that can survive almost anything. The fungal component of an orc's body replaces most of the organs that would be vulnerable in a human. No kidneys, no liver, no spleen in the conventional sense. Instead, a cavity inside the torso filled with what biologists studying captured greenskins have described as a thick, rich, fungal soup that handles all the complex biochemistry a human body would require specialized organs to process. The orc's skull is approximately 2 inches thick. Its bones are shot through with a spongy fungal matter that absorbs impacts the way a crumple zone in a vehicle absorbs a crash, giving a resilience to blunt force trauma that should be mechanically impossible in a biological creature. You can shoot an orc through the chest with a weapon that would drop a space marine in his tracks, and the orc will look down at the wound, register mild irritation at the inconvenience, and keep walking toward you. The orc's cardiovascular and respiratory systems are similarly over-engineered for redundancy. Multiple hearts. Respiratory absorption that allows the orc to extract oxygen from environments that would render a human unconscious in minutes. The circulatory fluid that the orcs call blood is green, rich in chlorophyll analogues that allow limited photosynthetic function. In a pinch, an orc can go without conventional food for extended periods simply by standing in direct sunlight. while burning through reserves that would take a human a week to deplete. Their immune system is, by any measure, extraordinary, a consequence of the fungal component providing a chemical defense mechanism rather than a cellular one, meaning that pathogens which have evolved to defeat cellular immunity find the orcs' defenses operating on a completely different principle that they have not been calibrated to circumvent. More than that, orcs reproduce not through any biological process involving two parents, but through spores. Every orc constantly releases spores throughout its life and releases them in massive quantities at the moment of death. Those spores sink into the soil of whatever world the orc happens to be standing on when it dies, and over the following weeks and months, they grow, first into fungus, then into squigs, little round biting creatures that serve as the orc equivalent of livestock, then into Gretchen, smaller and more cunning, the goblin-like labourers of the orcoid ecosystem, and finally into orc boys themselves. Fully grown warriors, armed with whatever they can find, born already knowing how to fight because that knowledge is written into their genetic code at a level deeper than memory. They do not need to be taught. The old ones wrote the curriculum directly into the genome. This means something truly unsettling, something that the Imperium has never found a satisfactory answer to. You cannot actually clear an orc from a planet by winning a battle against them. Even if you kill every single orc in a fight and celebrate your total victory, the dead orcs are seeding the ground beneath your feet as they fall. In 50 years or 100, or sometimes just a few decades, new orc tribes start emerging from the wilderness. The planet that you thought you had cleansed is infested all over again, from the inside out. The only way to truly remove orcs from a world, according to the most ruthless strategists in the Imperium, is exterminatus, burning the entire planet from orbit, sterilizing it down to bedrock. And even then, there is no guarantee that some of the spores did not escape into space before you started. Orcs seeding a new world from a ship, carried in the dust of their own bodies, drifting through the void as microscopic hitchhikers on debris from a battle. This is not a theoretical concern. It is a documented phenomenon. The orcs are, in the most literal sense of the phrase, unkillable. They exist as a species in a state that biology has no adequate term for, but not immortal exactly, since individual orcs die constantly and in large numbers, but something closer to immortal at the species level, a system in which the death of every individual becomes a generative act rather than simply a loss, in which the end of one orc is also the planting of 100 future orcs in the soil beneath its corpse. Death, for the orcs, is a reproductive strategy. But the truly dangerous part of orc biology, the thing that elevates them from a persistent nuisance to a civilization-ending threat, is what happens when they fight. Specifically, what happens to the biggest and most successful among them. Orcs grow continuously throughout their lives. Unlike humans, who reach a maximum size and then stop, an orc never stops growing. And the thing that drives orc growth is success in combat. Every fight an orc wins, and every enemy it crushes, every battle it survives, contributes to a biological feedback loop that builds muscle, thickens bone, and increases size. A young orc boy is maybe 2 meters tall, broad across the shoulders, genuinely terrifying to face in a dark corridor. But an orc who has been fighting and winning for decades will be 3 meters, 4, and an orc who has been fighting and winning for centuries, who has built an empire and conquered worlds and scattered armies before him, can grow to sizes that should not be possible for any living creature. The mechanism behind this is not fully understood, even by the most advanced xenobiologists in the Ordo Xenos. The current leading theory involves the interaction between the orc's animal physiology and its fungal component. Specifically, just that successful combat produces chemical and electrical signals in the orc's nervous system that trigger the fungal component to synthesize additional structural materials at an accelerated rate, effectively using the body's own biology as a construction site. Victory literally rebuilds the orc who achieves it. Every fight won is also a round of augmentation. an upgrade to the biological systems that will fight the next battle. And this process, unlike human muscle growth, has no theoretical ceiling. There is no point at which an orc's biology says it has grown large enough and stops. It simply continues, as long as the orc continues to fight and continues to win. And there is another layer to this. Orcs generate a collective psychic field, a gestalt resonance that emerges from every single greenskin on a battlefield and combines into something larger than the sum of its parts. The more orcs present, the stronger this field becomes. The stronger the field, the larger and more powerful the dominant orc at the center of it grows. It creates a biological and psychic feedback loop of stunning efficiency. More orcs means a stronger field. A stronger field means a bigger boss. A bigger boss draws more orcs, because every orc in the galaxy instinctively knows to follow whoever is biggest. And on it goes. A self-reinforcing spiral of violence and growth that, left unchecked, can escalate until a single warlord commands hordes so vast they darken the skies of entire planets. This collective field also does something that Imperial scholars have argued about for centuries. Though the Adeptus Mechanicus once theorized that it was what allowed crude orc technology, weapons and vehicles that by any rational engineering analysis should not work, to function anyway. The orcs believe something will work. And the sheer weight of all those minds believing the same thing hard enough bends reality just enough that it does. Orc rocket fuel painted red burns hotter. Vehicles covered in roaring faces actually go faster. This is not metaphor. This is documented, repeatable, empirically observable effect. The same orc vehicle, piloted by an orc who genuinely believes the red paint makes it faster, demonstrably produces higher velocities than the identical vehicle with unpainted panels under controlled conditions. Reality yields to the conviction of sufficient numbers. And it is the universe deciding that if enough beings with psychic capacity agree on something strongly enough, it becomes true. The orcs, despite their apparent simplicity, are constantly reshaping reality around them through the aggregate power of shared conviction, which means that a sufficiently large orc horde is not just a military threat, it is a metaphysical one. The gestalt field at the heart of an enormous greenskin advance can grow powerful enough that it amplifies the strength and aggression of every individual in the horde, pushes the dominant warboss to sizes that challenge the laws of biology, and begins to influence the physical world around them in ways that baffle measurement. Some early inquisitors assigned to study orc culture noted that the gestalt field of a truly large and battle-driven horde could be detected through psychic means at ranges of hundreds of kilometers. A background humming in the warp, a sense of animal hunger and communal purpose that felt nothing like the complex and often treacherous psychic signatures of human groups, or the cool, structured resonance of Eldar activity. It felt, one scholar wrote, like standing near a very large, very old engine, something with enormous power that did not require your understanding of it in order to function perfectly. This is what the Emperor and his Primarchs were fighting against during the Great Crusade. Not just soldiers, not just an army. A species that turned violence itself into a growth engine, some that had been built by ancient engineers to function as the galaxy's most perfect weapon. And that had been running that program, growing and fighting and expanding for an unbroken stretch of time, measured not in years or centuries, but in geological epochs. When an orc warlord rose to a level of power significant enough to threaten a star system, or a sector, or an entire region of the galaxy, the Imperium of that era did not take such threats lightly. The Emperor himself understood, perhaps better than any of his generals or advisors, exactly what the greenskins represented. He had walked among civilizations when orcs were already ancient. He knew their history in ways that no recorded text could capture, and he knew that if a warboss ever grew unchecked long enough, the threat they posed was not the kind of threat you could simply shoot your way out of. You needed to cut the head off, fast, and with overwhelming force. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, before we step forward into the battles that define this story. Because the Emperor was not a figure who frightened easily. He was not a being who overreacted to threats or committed resources beyond what was strictly necessary. And yet, on more than one occasion during the Great Crusade, the Orcs pushed him to a point where even he felt the need to personally intervene, where even he judged that leaving the fight to others carried too much risk. That tells you everything you need to know about how seriously this particular enemy was taken. Now let us meet them. Part 2, the Emperor's Golden Age. To understand what made the Orc threat during the Great Crusade so significant, you need to understand the world it existed within. Because the Great Crusade was not just a military campaign. It was the single greatest act of civilizational construction in human history. The defining moment when humanity's destiny was, for one shining, terrible, glorious window of time, genuinely within reach. The Emperor of mankind had been alive for somewhere in the region of 38,000 years by the time the Great Crusade began in approximately 798 of the 30th millennium. He had spent most of those years working quietly behind the scenes of human civilization, guiding things where he could, waiting for conditions to shift to a point where he could act openly and on a larger scale. But he watched humanity spread across the stars during the dark age of technology. He watched the catastrophe unfold as psychic evolution awakened untrained talents in millions of humans simultaneously, feeding the newborn chaos god Slaanesh in the warp. He endured the age of strife, 5,000 years of warp storms so severe that faster-than-light travel became nearly impossible, and watched helplessly as the human worlds that had been spreading across the galaxy were cut off from each other, battered by war, mutation, and the predations of every hostile species that had ever resented human expansion. Through all of this, the Emperor was present, in various guises, under various names. He was the guiding hand behind certain moments of human history that later seemed too significant, too perfectly timed to have been accidental. He waited, and he planned, and he worked, because the Emperor's defining quality, for both good and ill, was patience. He could see far enough ahead that he was willing to accept short-term suffering in exchange for long-term positioning. Whether that quality was wisdom or its own kind of tragedy is a question that the Warhammer universe asks, but never quite answers. And then the storms broke, the warp calmed, and the Emperor moved. He began on Terra, unified the surviving human factions there through a combination of negotiation, diplomacy, and when necessary, overwhelming force delivered by armies he had spent the age of strife quietly building. He fought the unification wars, drawing the scattered city-states and warlord domains of Terra under a single authority for the first time in thousands of years. Then he reached out to Mars, and struck the treaty that would give him the technological and manufacturing capacity to build what he needed. The Mechanicum of Mars, ancient and powerful and deeply suspicious of outside authority, recognized in the Emperor something they had not encountered before, a being whose understanding of the technologies they revered exceeded their own. The treaty was struck, the two-headed eagle was adopted as the symbol of their alliance, and the Imperium of Man was born in the moment that the two greatest civilizations remaining in the solar system agreed to move together. Then he began the project that would define the next 2 centuries of history, the creation of the Primarchs, 20 beings of engineered perfection, each shaped to be the finest warrior commander a human civilization could produce, each carrying gene seed that could in turn be used to create thousands of space marines, the elite shock troops who would accompany every expeditionary fleet. The Primarchs were not simply military assets, they were also symbols, embodiments of human aspiration, walking proof that humanity could produce something magnificent, something almost beyond comparison. Each was designed with a different emphasis, a different set of gifts, as though the Emperor was engineering a complete palette of human capability rather than simply producing 20 variations on a single theme. Horus, the diplomat, the strategist, the one who could read any situation and find the optimal response. Rogel Dawn, the architect, the one who looked at any problem and found the load-bearing wall that, once identified, made the rest solvable. Mortarion, the survivor, is the one built to endure, to outlast, to win by refusing to die. Sanguinius, the inspiration, the one whose presence in a battle made every human around him remember what they were fighting for. And so on, across all 20, each one a genius in their domain. And then, because nothing in the 40K universe is ever allowed to go cleanly, the Chaos Gods scattered them, plucked them from their gestation pods and hurled them to worlds across the galaxy, separating the Emperor from his children before their creation was even complete. The Emperor spent the early decades of the Great Crusade not just conquering worlds, but finding his lost sons one by one and bringing them back into the fold. Each discovery was a reunion that the Emperor approached with a kind of hunger he never otherwise showed. The Primarchs had each grown up on alien worlds, yet in circumstances that had shaped them in directions the Emperor had not intended, building capacities and traumas and loyalties that complicated the simple, clean role they had been designed for. Some were easy to love, some were difficult, some were, even at this early stage, harboring seeds of the damage that the Chaos Gods would eventually cultivate. But all of them were his. For roughly 200 years, the Great Crusade pressed forward, somewhere in the vicinity of 4,300 primary expeditionary fleets at the campaign's peak, each one pushing further into the darkness, bringing human worlds back under the single banner of the Imperium, exterminating or driving back every Xenos species that stood in the way. Orcs, Eldar raiders, the Rangda, the Leia, dozens of species that history has since forgotten or buried. The Great Crusade was not polite. It was not negotiated. It came in fire and adamantium, and asked only one question of every world it found: are you human? If the answer was yes, compliance was offered. If compliance was refused, there was a second question: are you still resisting? The answer to that second question was always the same. But amid all this, amid the conquest of planets and the burning of alien civilizations, and the steady grinding advance of the greatest military force in human history, the Orcs were a constant, nagging, perpetual problem. They were everywhere. The Great Crusade encountered them on world after world, systems where they had established dominance during the Age of Strife, when humanity could not resist them. And while a single Orc warband or even a large tribe was a manageable threat for a well-equipped expeditionary fleet, there were places in the galaxy where the Orcs had been left unchecked for 5,000 years. In those places, they had done what Orcs do when left alone. They had fought, they had grown, they had built empires, and a few of those empires were large enough, old enough, and centered on warbosses powerful enough that they represented challenges not for expeditionary fleets, but for the combined might of multiple Space Marine legions under the personal command of Primarchs, and occasionally for something more than even that. Just the pattern of how the Great Crusade dealt with Orc threats tells you something about the escalating severity of what it was encountering as it pushed deeper into territory that had been Orc-dominated for generations. Early in the Crusade, an expeditionary fleet with a company or two of Space Marines leading the way could handle most greenskin opposition it encountered. Then it became a matter of full companies, then full chapters by the organization of the time, then full legions. Each escalation was a response to the fact that the deeper the Crusade pushed, the larger the Orc concentrations it found, and the larger those concentrations were, the more powerful the individual warbosses at their center had grown. This is where our story begins to get specific. To Part 3, Garl Blackfang and the Emperor's Intervention. The Battle of Gyros Thravian does not get the attention it deserves in the broader telling of Great Crusade history. It is overshadowed by the larger, more dramatic events that followed. The Ulanor Crusade, the Triumph, the Horus Heresy. But for anyone who wants to understand the true scale of the Orc threat during this period, Gyros Thravian is essential. The Orc warboss who made this battle necessary was named Garl Blackfang. Even among the named warlords of Orc history, a list that includes some genuinely terrifying entries, Blackfang occupies a singular position. The scholars and xenobiologists who have attempted to piece together his history from fragmentary imperial records describe him as quite possibly the physically largest orc warboss that has ever been recorded in the entire history of the species, and that is a claim that deserves to be weighed carefully, because we will later discuss the beast of the 32nd Millennium, who was estimated to be the size of a hab block, armoured head to foot in power armour of his own construction, and capable of speaking flawless Gothic. That Blackfang is even mentioned in the same context as "the beast tells you something." His skin was notable even by orc standards, black rather than the green that characterises almost every other member of the species. While this may have been a mutation produced by the extraordinary concentration of the Gestalt psychic field around an orc who had grown beyond any previously recorded scale, or it may have been a more ancient inheritance from lineages of orcs that predate the current era. The records are fragmentary enough that the xenobiologists of the Ordo Xenos who later studied the accounts could not draw firm conclusions. What they could agree on was that every description of Blackfang emphasized his size above all other features. He was, as one fragmentary Imperial account put it, something that you did not initially process as a living creature. You saw the scale of him, and your mind tried to file it as terrain, as fortification, as a vehicle, and then it moved, and the wrongness of that misclassification hit you with a physical force. Sir Blackfang had built his empire somewhere in the general region of the galactic center, and the greenskin hordes he commanded were of a scale that had effectively stopped the Great Crusade's advance through that entire region of space. Imperial expeditionary fleets probing into the territory controlled by his horde kept meeting resistance that overwhelmed their projections. The orcs were not just numerous, they were large, disturbingly, uniformly large, in a way that Imperial analysts eventually concluded was a direct consequence of Blackfang's psychic field. His Gestalt resonance was so powerful that it was bleeding outward through the ranks of his army, pushing every orc in his horde to grow larger and more aggressive than orcs ordinarily would be. Fighting his forces was not like fighting a standard greenskin army, as it was like fighting an army of warbosses, every rank of it seething with the kind of individual combat capability that in any normal orc society would have produced constant internal fighting for dominance. Blackfang's psychic field, apparently, was strong enough to suppress that fighting, to impose a hierarchy of force rather than a hierarchy of ambition, in which every orc in the horde instinctively understood that challenging anything was futile when the ultimate boss was so obviously and so completely beyond challenge. The individual orc warriors his army produced were the result of this unique dynamic, bigger than standard orc boys, more aggressive, with the kind of combat experience that only comes from decades of continuous warfare under the discipline of an apex warlord. They were not, in the conventional sense, elite troops. The orcs do not produce elite troops the way that imperial societies do, through selection and specialized training. But they were the product of a biological system that had been running in overdrive for longer than most Space Marine legions had existed, and the result was an army in which even the most ordinary rank-and-file warrior was a genuine threat to a Space Marine in close combat. The Imperial response was substantial. 3 full Space Marine legions were committed to the campaign against Blackfang's empire, 3 Primarchs leading in person, Horus Lupercal and his Lunar Wolves, who were at this point already established as the finest shock troops in the Crusade, and the Primarch most often tapped for the most dangerous operations. Rogel Dawn and his Imperial Fists, methodical and unyielding, the masters of fortification and attrition, who could grind down any enemy given time and sufficient ammunition, and whose Primarch was physically one of the most powerful among the 20 brothers, a being of stone-like certainty whose presence on a battlefield was simultaneously an anchor and a declaration, and Mortarion, Lord of the Death Guard, whose legion was known for its extraordinary resilience and its willingness to fight in the most punishing, miserable conditions imaginable without slowing down. The Death Guard did not know how to stop. It was a quality their Primarch had selected for, deliberately, because he understood from his own savage upbringing that the enemy you cannot outlast is the enemy you cannot defeat. 3 Primarchs, 3 full legions. Each legion at this point comprised tens of thousands of space marines, as the finest warriors humanity had ever created, armed with weapons that could reduce fortifications to rubble, wearing armor that could shrug off the kind of fire that would slaughter unaugmented soldiers by the thousands. Supported by the Imperial army forces that accompanied every expedition, hundreds of thousands of human soldiers with tanks and artillery and air support, supporting Titan legions providing the kind of firepower that could flatten city blocks. By any rational military calculus, this force should have been sufficient to defeat any threat short of another Space Marine Legion. They were very nearly destroyed. The records of what happened at Gyros Thravian are incomplete, as is often the case with battles that do not go as planned. Imperial scribes in subsequent eras had a tendency to clean up uncomfortable truths or emphasize the moments of eventual triumph rather than sit with the reality of what almost happened. But what the records do say is stark enough. The combined forces of 3 legions, led by 3 primarchs, found themselves on the verge of defeat at the hands of Blackfang's horde, not losing ground slowly, not in a difficult, hard-fought battle where every meter was contested and the outcome remained unclear. On the verge of defeat. The word verge is doing a lot of work there, and the original sources are careful about it, but they are not careful enough to obscure what it means. 3 legions, perhaps 90,000 space marines, and the supporting armies that accompanied them, facing an orc horde large enough and powerful enough that those numbers and that quality were not sufficient to guarantee victory. The nature of Blackfang's horde, every member of it amplified by the most powerful Gestalt field in recorded greenskin history, had produced an army that simply absorbed the kinds of concentrated fire that should have been devastating and kept advancing. The Primarchs were fighting. Horus was fighting. Dawn was fighting. Mortarion was fighting. And it was not enough. This is a sentence that deserves to be held still for a moment. Horus Lupercal and Rogel Dawn and Mortarion, 3 of the most physically and tactically capable beings in the galaxy, were fighting with their full legions behind them, and they were losing. The orc horde was too large, the individual warriors too powerful. Was the collective psychic field too strong for even this level of response to break cleanly through? And then the Emperor came. He had been aboard his flagship, the Bucephalus, overseeing the broader campaign from orbit. The precise moment when he made the decision to descend is not recorded. Whether it came from reports filed by his primarchs, from his own psychic awareness of how the battle was unfolding, or from some calculation only he could make, is unknown. What is known is that he descended to the surface of Gyros Thravian with 1,000 Legio Custodes, his personal bodyguard, the 10,000 warriors he had spent decades crafting each individually. He's selecting and training and augmenting each one in a process that made the creation of a space marine look comparatively simple, and he personally led them into the heart of Blackfang's horde. 1,000 Custodes, against an army large enough that 3 legions had been unable to break it. Consider what that commitment represents. These were not regular soldiers deployed as reinforcement for a struggling operation. These were the Emperor's personal guard, each one a warrior of such exceptional capability that a single custodian could, in the right circumstances, hold a doorway against a dozen space marines. The Emperor's decision to commit them was not made lightly. The Custodes were irreplaceable in a way that even space marines were not. Was because their creation required the Emperor's personal attention in a way that Legion recruitment did not. Every custodian lost was a loss that could not be easily replaced, and the Emperor knew this better than anyone. He committed them anyway, and he led them personally. The result was, by any measure, one of the most one-sided military engagements in the history of the Great Crusade. The Custodes swept through Blackfang's elite warriors like a blade through fog. At the center of the action was the Emperor himself, fighting toward the biggest target on the battlefield, the only target that mattered. He found Blackfang atop a towering gargant, the massive walking war machines that orc mech boys construct in honor of their twin war gods. And in a duel that the records describe only in the broadest terms, he killed him, decapitated him. Shum, the most powerful orc warboss in recorded history, cut down by the being who, At that moment,
Before I keep going, I just want to take a second to say something that I think about a lot with 40k lore and specifically with the orc stuff. People sleep on this faction so hard, and I get it, because on the surface they look like the comic relief, the goofy ones, the faction you play when you want to have fun and not take the game seriously. But the more I sit with the lore, like genuinely read it, think about it, the more I think orcs might be the most quietly terrifying thing in this entire setting. Like, chaos is scary because it's personal, it wants your soul, it corrupts it, it whispers. The Tyranids are terrifying because of the scale, but orcs are scary because they don't need a reason. They don't want anything from you. They're just doing what they were literally built to do since before humanity existed, and they're extraordinarily good at it. And I think that deserves more respect than it gets. But anyway, let's go back to the video.
stood at the apex of human civilization. Around the Emperor, the 1,000 custodies completed their work with a thoroughness that bordered on the clinical. Over 100,000 greenskins died in the engagement, not in the broader battle, but in this specific focused action by the Emperor and his bodyguard. The losses on the Imperial side, 3 custodians. 3. That exchange rate, 100,000 orcs killed for the loss of 3 custodians, is the kind of statistic that seems like it might be Imperial propaganda. That seems too clean, too dramatic, too perfectly scripted to be taken at face value. But the sources that record this number are not given to flattering exaggeration, and the logic of how custodian warfare functions supports it. Each individual custodian is, in terms of personal combat power, considerably beyond even a space marine. They are larger, faster, better equipped, more intelligent, and trained in ways that the Astartes, remarkable as they are, simply are not. A single custodian fighting a single orc boy is not a contest. 1,000 custodians fighting 100,000 orcs is a massacre of precisely the kind the records describe. What the 3 losses represent is the price of fighting Blackfang's elite, the warlord's own guard, his hand-picked best, orcs that had been living in the amplifying presence of the strongest Gestalt field in greenskin history for decades or centuries. Even the custodies were not immune to an orc of sufficient size and ferocity, and the 3 who fell were presumably lost to exactly that, being so amplified by their proximity to Blackfang that they could, briefly, threaten even a custodian in direct combat. The death of Blackfang accomplished exactly what the death of any orc warlord accomplishes. Without the focus of his psychic field, without the presence of the biggest boss, the greenskin horde fragmented. The coordinated threat dissolved into 1,000 squabbling warbands, each fighting each other as much as fighting the Imperial forces. And those Imperial forces, 3 legions who had been pushed to their limits, suddenly found themselves dealing with something entirely manageable. The battle was won, the campaign was won, but the lesson should not have been missed. Should not have been, but ultimately was. Because the lesson of Gyros Thravian was not that the Emperor was powerful enough to kill any orc warlord. Of course he was. The lesson was that the orcs, given enough time and enough battles and enough victories, could grow to a scale where 3 of his finest primarchs were insufficient to stop them. That there was a size at which the greenskin threat outpaced conventional military response. That the gap between a manageable orc problem and a civilization-ending one was not a matter of kind, but of degree, and that degree could be crossed before anyone recognized it was approaching. In the years between Gyros Thravian and the Ulanor Crusade, that lesson was applied, at least in part. The approach used at Ulanor, strike fast, strike at the head, as decapitate before the body can respond, was shaped in part by the understanding of what happened when you let an orc warlord sit in his throne room for too long, growing fatter on the psychic energy of an ever-expanding horde. The lesson was remembered. The institutional memory of Gyros Thravian informed Horus's planning in ways that led to one of the finest military operations ever executed. But the deeper lesson, about what happens when you win and then stop watching, that one got lost, somewhere between the victory celebration and the comfortable certainty that followed. Part 4. Erlac Urg and the Empire of Ulanor, the Orc Empire. The that would become the focus of the greatest military operation in the history of the Great Crusade, had its center in the Ulanor system, in the region of space known as the Ulanor sector. And the being at the center of it, the Warboss who had built 12 star systems into a coherent empire, who had enslaved human populations across a dozen worlds, who had accumulated centuries of victories, and with each victory grown larger and more dangerous, was named Erlac Urg. Note the name carefully. Erlac Urg, the Overlord, the Supreme Warlord, the Orc, at the top of a hierarchy that stretched across more territory than most of the individual human empires the Great Crusade had been encountering. He is sometimes referred to in records as Erlac Urg, or variations on that spelling. The imperial scribes who transcribed Orc names were working phonetically, and greenskin naming conventions are not exactly standardized. But whatever the spelling, the entity being named is the same. Urg's empire had grown organically over time, the way all Orc empires grow, through combat. A successful warboss attracts followers. A warboss with more followers wins more fights. A warboss who wins more fights grows bigger. A bigger warboss attracts even more followers, and the cycle continues, feeding on itself in the way that Orc biology is specifically designed to enable. Urg had been running this cycle for long enough that his horde had outgrown the level at which subordinate warbosses led their own operations, and had reached the level at which an entire sector of space answered to a single command structure. This was not, it needs to be understood, a primitive tribal arrangement. The Orc Empire under Urg was a functioning interstellar polity. It had its own hierarchy of nobs and subordinate warbosses, each commanding significant forces of their own, forces that in any other context would have been dangerous enough to require full expeditionary fleets to address. It had territory that it defended and expanded. It had enslaved populations performing labor for it, human populations from the dozen worlds that Urg's forces had conquered during the Age of Strife, reduced to servitude in the Orcs' mines and workshops and construction projects, toiling to build the weapons and structures that the Empire required. The central planets of his empire had been entirely settled and modified by Orcs, their surfaces covered with the rough-edged, utilitarian architecture that mechboys construct when given a planet to work with for generations. Vast scrapyard cities, workshop complexes the size of continents, to fortress walls built from the compressed and welded wreckage of 1,000 previous conflicts. And over all of it, in a fortress palace on the capital world of Ulanor Prime, sat Urg himself, massive, old by Orc standards, surrounded by the largest and most dangerous warriors in his horde. The fortress palace was itself a monument to the kind of imperial ambition that Orcs express not through architecture in the aesthetic sense, but through sheer, crushing scale. It was enormous, not because Orc designers had a vision of proportion and beauty they were trying to express, but because everything an Orc of Urg's scale builds is enormous by simple necessity. The doors had to be large enough for him to pass through. The throne room had to be large enough to hold him and his guards simultaneously, as the tower at the center had to be tall enough that the Overlord looking out from its summit could see the full extent of his domain and feel the satisfying certainty that nothing within his visible horizon challenged him, governing, in the way that an apex predator governs the territory it controls, by being the thing that nothing else is willing to challenge. This is not metaphor. An Orc warlord does not govern through institutions, through laws, through legitimacy, in any abstract sense. He governs because if you try to take his position, he kills you, and because everyone who might try has watched him kill everyone who has ever tried before. And the accumulated weight of that evidence produces a kind of stability, not peace. Orc empires are never peaceful. There is always raiding and fighting in the lower levels of the hierarchy, but a directed stability, all the violence pointed outward by the simple fact that pointing it at the boss is not an option. By the time Imperial forces identified the Ulanor Empire as requiring attention, its Orc population was outnumbering the Imperial forces being considered for the assault by a ratio of 5 to 1. 5 greenskins for every Imperial soldier. And remember that each of those greenskins was a creature designed to fight, carrying centuries of accumulated combat adaptation in its genetic code, capable of surviving wounds that would kill multiple humans, and backed by the collective psychic resonance of a horde that size. The Great Crusade had faced large orc empires before. Gyros Thravian had demonstrated what could happen if you underestimated the scale of the problem. The strategists around Horus, who was increasingly the de facto military mind behind the most ambitious operations of the Crusade, understood that Ulanor required something unprecedented, not an expeditionary fleet, not 2 or 3 legions, the full weight of the Crusade, pointed at a single target, operated with such precision and such speed that the vast numerical advantage of the defending orcs could not be brought to bear before the head of the snake was removed. This became the Ulanor Crusade, and the numbers attached to it remain staggering even now, 10,000 years later. 100,000 Space Marines. That figure alone needs a moment to sit with. Why? Because it represents a commitment of force that the Great Crusade never made twice. 100,000 Astartes, drawn primarily from 3 legions, Horus's Lunar Wolves, the White Scars of Jaghatai Khan, and the Ultramarines of Rabute Gilliman. 8 million soldiers from the Imperial Army, the human troops who formed the bulk of all Great Crusade expeditionary forces. 600 warships of the Imperialis Armada, the vast fleet required to carry, support, and supply this force across the void. And 100 titans of the Legio Mortis, the great walking war machines of the Mechanicum, each one a battlefield unto itself. This was not an expeditionary fleet. This was a crusade in the truest sense of the word. The Emperor himself was present. This was the last battle in which he would personally lead his forces, though none of the participants knew that at the time. What they knew was that the Orc Empire of Erlac Urg was the greatest single threat to the Great Crusade then known, and that its elimination was not negotiable. Part 5. The Battle for Ulanor. Green Sky and Iron Rain. The assault on Ulanor began with misdirection, and it was misdirection designed by one of the finest military minds ever to exist. Horus Lupercal had developed what contemporaries and later historians called his spear-tip tactic, a doctrine of striking directly at the heart of any enemy command structure and destroying it before the broader defensive force could react. The theory was elegant in its brutality. Leadership is the nervous system of any military force. Remove it, and the body continues to function for a time, but it loses coordination, loses direction. It begins to fracture along the fault lines that were always present, but held together by a dominant will. Against an Orc empire, this logic was even more apt than usual. The greenskin command structure was entirely personality-based. Urg's subordinate warbosses obeyed him because he was bigger than they were, and because his psychic field was powerful enough that every Orc in his vicinity instinctively registered him as the dominant being. Remove him, and that psychic anchor vanished. The nobs and warbosses who had been following him would immediately begin competing among themselves for dominance, each one convinced he was now the biggest boss in the room. The cohesion that made the empire function as an empire would dissolve overnight. But to execute the spear tip, you first needed to draw the Orc defensive forces away from the target. And the outer worlds of the Ulanor system served that purpose perfectly. The White Scars and the Ultramarines, supported by Imperial Army regiments and the Titan legions, launched the opening phase of the Ulanor Crusade against the outlying planets of the system. From the Orc perspective, this looked like the main thrust of the Imperial assault, the obvious frontal attack that any competent defender would concentrate forces against. And the Orcs responded as expected. Their fleets surged toward the outer planets, pulling forces away from the central world, leaving the heart of the Empire exposed. It was while the attention of the Orc defensive forces was focused outward that Horus made his move. The Lunar Wolves' fleet drove straight for Ulanor Prime, not cautiously, or not at a measured pace that would allow the Orcs time to recognize what was happening and redirect their forces. Directly, with every available resource pushed to maximum speed, threading through the gaps left by the Orc naval forces that had been pulled toward the outer planets by the White Scars and Ultramarines. Drop pods began hitting the surface of Ulanor Prime in a concentrated mass landing, each one carrying a squad of lunar wolves already kicking the door open before the deceleration smoke had cleared. Heavy gunships came in right behind them, deploying land raiders and predators and armored space marines, who immediately began advancing on the fortress palace at the center of the planet's main continent. The Orc defensive forces on the planet were substantial. Numerically, they still likely outnumbered the Imperial attacking force, but numbers mean less when your enemy is executing a plan this tightly orchestrated, when his forces are moving with a coherent purpose that your own forces are struggling to counter because the brain that would direct that counter-move is still alive and still on the planet, and his every instinct is to hold his best warriors around him rather than commit them prematurely. Urg, as the records describe, kept 40 of his biggest knobs close to him as the battle raged outside his fortress. 40 warriors, each of whom would have been a significant warboss in any other context, each chosen because they were among the largest, strongest, and most survivable greenskins in the entire empire. They formed a ring of muscle and iron around their master, waiting for whatever was coming. As Horus was coming. With all the Terminators from the elite First Company of the Lunar Wolves, led by their commander, First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon, Horus teleported directly to the base of the great central tower of Urg's fortress palace, the Tower of Ulanor. This structure, the architectural centerpiece of the entire empire, rose above the battlefield like a declaration. Everything that Urg had built, everything he had conquered and enslaved and accumulated, was represented in that single massive structure, and at its summit, the Overlord waited. Most of the Terminators held the base of the tower, against the waves of greenskins rushing back from the perimeter walls, trying to reach their master. The outer walls had already been breached by lunar wolves advancing from the drop zone. The Orcs were caught between two lines of space marines, from the ones pushing inward from outside the fortress and the ones who had teleported into its heart. In the chaos of that crossfire, coordinated response was nearly impossible. Horus took 10 Terminators, the Justarin, Abaddon's personal squad, his deadliest warriors, up the tower, through chambers filled with Orc guards who presumably had some dim awareness that this was the worst possible development, but lacked either the authority or the coordination to do anything useful about it. Through rooms that would have been the administrative and ceremonial spaces of an Orc empire's central seat of power, stripped down to function in the greenskin way, brutal, purposeful, decorated with trophies and skulls and the scavenged wreckage of defeated enemies, up and up until they reached the throne room at the summit. It was part 6. The throne room at the top of the world. What Horus found when he arrived at the throne room of the Tower of Ulanor would have been, even for a Primarch, a moment that demanded absolute calm and absolute certainty. The room at the top of the most powerful Orc empire the Great Crusade had yet encountered was occupied by Erlac Urg and his 40 largest knobs. 40 warriors of the kind that would require a company of space marines to bring down individually, in some cases. 40 bodies of green muscle and improvised armor and jagged weapons, packed into a space that was large by human standards, but that must have felt considerably smaller with 40 very large Orcs, and 1 Primarch and 10 Terminator-armored space marines, all trying to occupy it simultaneously. There is no detailed record of how long the throne room fight lasted. Thus, there is no play-by-play breakdown of which knob fell to which lunar wolf, or in what order. What the records do tell us is the shape of it. Horus charged, not into the nearest available target, but straight toward the Overlord, ignoring the knobs surrounding him and trusting his Justarin to handle what he was leaving behind. The twin lightning claws he carried, weapons that could shear through ceramite with the ease of cutting paper, made short, brutal work of the bodies between him and his target. He did not fence with them. He moved through them, the way a force of nature moves through anything that happens to be in its path. The Terminators engaged the knobs, 10 space marines in Terminator armor, the heaviest individual warrior gear the Imperium could field. fighting 40 elite orc warriors in a room with walls. It was not clean. Your Terminator armor is proof against most things short of a dedicated anti-vehicle weapon, but an orc knob at sufficient size and power can make even Terminator armor feel inadequate through sheer kinetic violence. Axes and hammers of the kind orc knobs favor, oversized and brutal, are not precision weapons, but they do not need to be. A direct enough hit transfers enough energy to matter even through several centimeters of adamantium. At some point in the chaos, every single Terminator in the room was killed. Every orc knob in the room was also killed. When Horus returned from the balcony after dealing with Urg, he found Ezekiel Abaddon standing alone amid a pile of broken orc bodies and broken Imperial bodies, covered in ichor and blood, the sole survivor of all those warriors on both sides. Yet that tells you something about the room Horus left behind when he went for the Overlord. The duel between Horus and Erlac Urg is one of those events in Warhammer lore that is described sparely enough that you are forced to fill in the gaps with your own imagination. And imagination working from what we know about both participants can take you somewhere genuinely striking. Urg was, the records emphasize, genuinely gargantuan, not just large by orc standards, which already means considerably larger than a space marine, large enough that even a Primarch, and Horus was one of the taller, more physically imposing of the 20 brothers, would have been looking up. An orc warlord of this age and this success would have been fighting and winning for centuries. Every year of that history was written into his body. And the muscle that decades of combat had built on him was not the kind that regular exercise produces. It was the kind that only comes from actually surviving things that should have killed you, over and over, at a biological level that rewrites the body in response. His skin would have been thick enough that weapons which would cut cleanly through leather might require real effort to penetrate. His fists were weapons in themselves, not in a poetic sense, but literally, in the sense that an impact from a fist that size carries enough force to crack stone, to bend metal, to send a target flying several meters backward. Horus was a Primarch, a demigod, the finest warrior general his civilization had ever produced, operating at a level of physical capability that regular space marines looked at the way regular humans look at space marines. When he carried weapons designed to kill anything, he had trained for this kind of combat across a lifetime that, even at this point in history, already spanned centuries. They fought. The duel moved from the throne room to the battlements, which speaks to the scale of the movements involved. Neither combatant was stationary, and the space of the throne room apparently became insufficient as the fight escalated. On the exterior battlements of the Tower of Ulanor, high above the battle raging below, Horus and the Overlord of an interstellar empire decided the future. The outcome, as the records describe it, was not that Horus simply overpowered Urg through superior strength. A Primarch versus an Orc warlord of this scale is not necessarily a guaranteed mismatch in pure physical terms. Well, what the records say is that Horus crippled the Overlord in the duel, suggesting that the fight was real enough, sustained enough, that Urg managed to be a genuine threat before Horus found his opening and took it. An opening that left Urg grievously wounded, his body broken in ways that removed him as a threat, but that left him alive long enough for Horus to do what he did next. He picked Urg up, lifted the massive, screaming, broken body of the Overlord of the Ulanor Empire above his head, carried him to the edge of the battlements, and threw him, down from the top of the Tower of Ulanor, down through however many meters of empty air separated the throne room from the ground below, down to land among the mass of orcs still fighting at the base of the structure. What the records describe the outcome with the kind of brevity that suggests the scribes who wrote it found the image they were putting to paper either deeply satisfying or deeply disturbing, and could not quite decide which. There was, when Urg hit the ground, a green ichor splat. The death of Urg travelled through the battle the way deaths of this kind always travel through orc armies. Instantly, the psychic field that had been centered on him, that had been drawing energy from every greenskin on the planet and feeding it back outward with him at the center, collapsed like a building with its load-bearing wall removed. Every orc in the fortress palace and the surrounding battle, every orc whose ability to function as a coordinated warrior had been sustained by the presence of their overlord. Usha felt that collapse in a way that needed no explanation. The biggest boss was dead. And among orcs, there is no strategic concept, no military doctrine, no tradition of holding the line for a cause larger than yourself. There is only the boss, and the boss was dead. And now every other orc was suddenly calculating, in the limited and instinctive way that orcs calculate, whether they themselves might be the new biggest boss. The answer being uncertain, the appropriate response was to fight whoever was nearest and establish the answer through the only method available. The lunar wolves, advancing from the perimeter and holding the base of the tower, found the orc forces surrounding them dissolving into internecine chaos. They proceeded to kill everything that was confused enough to remain in range. The battle for Ulanor Prime, which had been contested and bloody up to that moment, became something simpler afterward. It became a slaughter. The rest of the Ulanor system fell within a year. The subordinate warbosses who might have continued the fight were too busy fighting each other to mount any coherent resistance to the Imperial advance. The outer planets that had been the focus of the White Scars and Ultramarines were secured. The slaves liberated from orc labor camps joined the Imperial force, and the Great Crusade had achieved what would be remembered as its single greatest victory. Part 7. The Triumph of Ulanor and the seeds of everything that followed. What happened next is, in its own way, as consequential as the battle itself. Perhaps more so, the Emperor ordered a triumph, not just a celebration, not a simple ceremony to mark the victory. A triumph in the grand ancient sense of the word, modelled consciously on the greatest victory celebrations of old Earth's history. The scale of what was required to stage this event says as much about the Emperor's intentions as any speech he gave at its conclusion. The Adeptus Mechanicus sent geoformer engines and their attendant armies of servitors and thralls to Ulanor Prime. They flattened an entire continent, not metaphorically, actually removed all geographical variation from a stretch of land and replaced it with a mirror-smooth granite surface. 5 kilometers wide and 500 kilometers long, this path became the primary parade ground. Along its entire length, every meter of that 500-kilometer route, orc skulls from the battle were displayed, countless thousands of them, which is arranged as a monument to both the victory and the cost of achieving it. At the far end of this road, on a mountaintop above the flattened plain, a citadel was constructed, and from that citadel, the Emperor watched as 8 million Imperial Army soldiers and thousands of armoured vehicles marched the full length of the path in parade formation. After them came hundreds of Titans from the Collegia Titanica, their footfalls making the ground shiver even across the distance. After the Titans came 14 Space Marine legions, the Lunar Wolves, Blood Angels, Death Guard, Thousand Suns, World Eaters, White Scars, Word Bearers, Imperial Fists, Emperor's Children, Raven Guard, Salamanders, Ultramarines, Iron Hands, and Dark Angels, whose warriors marched past in formations that stretched beyond the visible horizon. Of thousands of aircraft from the Imperial Armada cut patterns across the sky overhead, and standing on the citadel with the Emperor as they watched all of this, Horus, Sanguinius, the most beloved of the Primarchs whose wings caught the light, Mortarion, Angron, Magnus, Jaghatai Khan, Lorgar, Rogel Dawn, Fulgrim, Malkador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor, and the most powerful human psyker after the Emperor himself, Constantine Valdor, Captain General of the Custodes, the assembled leadership of the greatest civilization in human history, gathered at what was unquestionably its single highest point. The triumph built to its climax with Horus presented as its central figure, the hero of Ulanor, the mind that had designed and executed the greatest military operation in the history of the Crusade. And then the Emperor made his announcement, the announcement that nobody present anticipated, that fell on the assembled crowd with the disorienting quality of a genuine surprise, from a being who never surprised you if he could avoid it. He named Horus the War Master, above all other Primarchs, in command authority over every single military force of the Great Crusade, the Supreme Commander, second only to the Emperor himself, empowered to give orders to his fellow Primarchs as if they came from the Emperor's own mouth. The Lunar Wolves were renamed the Sons of Horus in his honor. A great mace called Worldbreaker was placed in his hands as a symbol of his new authority. And then the second announcement came. This one even more shocking. The Emperor was leaving. He was returning to Terra. He had great work to perform, important work, which work that required his personal presence and that he was not prepared to discuss in detail. The Great Crusade would continue under Horus's direction. The Primarchs would continue their campaigns. Humanity's expansion across the galaxy would not stop, but the Emperor himself was going home. The reactions of the Primarchs present varied, but the unifying thread through all of them was something between confusion and hurt. These were beings who had known the Emperor as a father, as a commander, as the axis around which their entire existence turned. Several of them had been found and reunited with him within living memory, memory that, for beings like them, was sharp and immediate. The abandonment was not rational. The Emperor had good reasons, as he always did. But good reasons felt like cold comfort when the person offering them was already walking toward his shuttle. The resentments planted in that moment did not grow quickly. They festered slowly, in the way that deep wounds fester, quietly, invisibly, spreading outward from the initial injury until one day the infection has reached something vital. The Chaos Gods would find them there, tending those resentments, offering whispers that were perfectly calibrated to the specific hurt of each individual Primarch, and 9 of the 20 would eventually be turned. None of this was the intention of Erlac Urg. The Orc warlord did not design the Ulanor Crusade. He did not plan the triumph. He had no interest in, and no awareness of the complicated political and emotional dynamics playing out among the beings who had just destroyed his empire. He was just an orc who had spent a long life fighting and winning and growing, and who had ultimately encountered an opponent who was simply better than him. But the victory over him, and the celebration that followed, and the decisions the Emperor made in the immediate aftermath of that celebration, set in motion consequences that would eventually bring the Horus heresy. The death of 100,000 space marines and billions of human soldiers in the worst civil war in human history, the breaking of the Primarchs, the internment of the Emperor on the Golden Throne, the birth of the Imperium, as it is known, in the 41st Millennium. Fractured, superstitious, grinding down under the weight of its own fear. All of that grew directly from the soil of Ulanor. The Imperium believed, after Ulanor, that the Orc threat had been broken forever, that the green tide had been pushed back far enough that it could never gather this kind of force again, that the galaxy's most persistent and dangerous pest had finally been dealt with permanently. This belief was, to put it charitably, optimistic. Part 8. The Long Sleep and the Returning Tide, between the Ulanor Crusade and what came next. 1,500 standard years passed. This is a span of time so vast it defies easy comprehension. 1,500 years. The distance between the first humans to attempt heavier than air flight and the present day, if you are reading this in the early 26th century. Long enough for entire civilizations to rise and fall. Long enough for the Horus heresy to happen, for the Emperor to be interred on the Golden Throne, was for the scattered and shattered legions to be reorganized into chapters, for the scouring to drive the traitor legions into the eye of terror, for the Imperium to slowly, painfully begin rebuilding. By the 32nd millennium, the Imperium was in what historians would later call the time of rebirth. The traitor legions were still confined, licking wounds in the eye of terror. The major Xenos threats were relegated to the galaxy's distant frontiers. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the worlds under Imperial control were experiencing something that they had almost forgotten the texture of. Peace. Not absolute peace, not the absence of all conflict. This is the 40,000 universe. There is never truly an absence of conflict, but comparative peace. The kind of peace that allows people to stop being afraid for a generation or two. And in that peace, complacency grew. The military organization that the Imperium had built in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Codex Astartes, the division of legions into smaller chapters, the deliberate limitation of any single commander's authority, was originally intended as a safeguard against another heresy. But over generations, it had also created a military structure that was less nimble, less capable of rapid concentrated response than the old legion system. The Imperial Fists, heirs to the tradition of Rogal Dawn, had spent so long as Terra's Praetorians that by this period many of their battle brothers had never experienced genuine combat. The whole apparatus of Imperial military might had grown, if not soft, then at least unpracticed, less sharp, slower to recognize threats and slower to respond. As into this moment of inherited confidence and unfamiliar quiet, something emerged from Ulanor. The orcs, remember, had never really gone away. The spores had sunk into every planet their forces touched during the Great Crusade. The survivors had scattered to systems across the region. Individual warbosses had built new empires, smaller than Urg's, but real and functional. The green tide does not stop. It simply waits, sometimes, for conditions to become favorable. The conditions that produced the War of the Beast were the product of 1,500 years of greenskin history that the Imperium was largely not paying attention to. In the ruins of what had been Urg's empire, in the system of Ulanor Prime itself, a new gathering had been occurring, and at the center of it, growing slowly, and then with gathering speed as more and more orcs were drawn into his orbit, was a being that history would record simply as the Beast. The reports that first reached the Imperium were confusing. Strange gravitational anomalies near Armageddon, a world in Segmentum Solar, well within the boundaries of Imperial space. The Imperial Fists. The entire chapter, the most prestigious warriors on Terra's doorstep, were dispatched to investigate. What they found was a moon, not a natural moon, but a moon with a face carved into its surface, a massive, snarling orc visage as large as a continent, capable of movement. The face opened its mouth, and the sound that came out was audible on the planet's surface and had the quality of a word being spoken in a language that nobody had heard before. As the gravity weapon that struck next from the attack moon devastated Armageddon, the Imperial Fists fought with everything they had. They died, almost all of them. The entire chapter, the inheritors of Rogal Dawn's legacy, the descendants of the warriors who had defended the Imperial Palace during the Horus Heresy, was reduced to a handful of survivors. The sole surviving senior officer of note was a captain named Corland, who would eventually carry the entire burden of his chapter's legacy on his shoulders through the crisis to come. The attack moon vanished into what the Adeptus Mechanicus would eventually identify as subspace, a dimensional realm, neither the materium nor the warp, a form of faster-than-light transit that did not require passing through the immaterium at all. It reappeared somewhere else, and then again, and each time it appeared, the world it orbited faced an orc invasion of an intensity that the Imperium had not encountered since the height of the Great Crusade. But it was not just the military pressure that made the War of the Beast different from all the orc threats that had come before it. It was what the orcs were doing, the technological sophistication they were demonstrating. The attack moons themselves were a feat of engineering that surpassed anything the Adeptus Mechanicus could have constructed. The orcs under the Beast were organizing along lines that should have been impossible, coordinating operations across star systems with a precision that required communication and planning, not just the brawling chaos that defined standard greenskin strategy. And the Beast himself, when he was finally encountered, was speaking. What in Gothic? Fluent, clear Gothic, with a vocabulary and rhetorical intelligence that should have been utterly beyond the capacity of any orc. He was enormous. The descriptions that came back from the few survivors of early encounters required careful calibration before being distributed through the Imperium. because the truth was considered too demoralizing to share broadly. The beast was not an orc, the way that Erlac Urg had been an orc, large and powerful and dangerous, but still recognizably within the scale of the known. The beast was something beyond that, 10 meters tall, encased in power armor that the orcs had apparently constructed for themselves, using methods that the Adeptus Mechanicus could not reverse engineer. Armored and armed at a scale where even a space marine looked like a child standing next to a construction vehicle. What he was also, it would eventually be revealed, not alone. The investigators who survived the effort to kill him discovered that there was not one beast but six prime orcs, each commanding what the Imperium began calling a legion of greenskins, each operating as a commander of a section of the greatest greenskin invasion in history. These were the apex of what orc biology was capable of producing, creatures that the Adeptus Mechanicus theorized might be the final, most extreme expression of the Old One's engineering, the point at which the orc species reached its highest possible form. They called them prime orcs and speculated that they might be equivalent to, or even descendant from, the Krork themselves. Gita Part 9, The Attack Moon, over Terra, the War of the Beast, escalated with a speed that left the Imperial military perpetually behind the curve of events. The Beast's forces did not simply fight where the Imperium expected them to fight. They fought everywhere. Every segmentum was hit. Every region of Imperial space saw orc forces of terrifying capability. The Ultramarines were pulled into defensive campaigns protecting Ultramar. The Space Wolves, Salamanders, and Raven Guard became too committed to their own defense to contribute to a wider response. The Imperium, designed after the Horus Heresy to resist any single entity gaining overwhelming power, was discovering the downside of that design. In a crisis requiring concentrated, coordinated response, it was fatally slow. Yet the moments that defined just how serious the situation had become can be measured in a series of escalating horrors that came one after another, with barely time to process the previous one. An attack moon appeared over Port Sanctus, one of the critical naval stations of Segmentum Solar. Its gravity weapon, a technology that even the Adeptus Mechanicus's finest engineers initially had no answer to, tore warships apart at a distance that rendered conventional naval combat irrelevant. The Imperial Navy lost enormous tonnage trying to engage it at range. The attack moon was eventually destroyed, but at a cost that the Imperium could not continue to pay per engagement. Then another appeared over Terra. Read that sentence again. An attack moon, a hollowed out, which weaponized moon traveling through a dimension that bypassed the warp entirely, parked itself in orbit over the throne world of humanity, over the world where the Emperor lay in his golden prison, over the planet that was not simply the Imperium's political capital, but the psychic anchor of the Astronomicon, the beacon that made warp travel possible across the entire galaxy. The attack on Terra was not just a military action, it was a statement of intent. The Beast knew exactly what Terra was. The Beast, who could speak Gothic, who could coordinate an empire across multiple star systems, who had chosen Ulanor Prime as his capital, because it was the world where Horus had made his reputation by crushing the Orc Empire of Erlac Urg. The Beast had a message he wanted to deliver. The message was, I remember what you did, and I know where you live, and I am here. The panic on Terra was real and immediate. The Adeptus RBTs fought to contain riots in the streets. Communication with Mars broke down as the Fabricator General withdrew cooperation. Thousands died in the civil disorder alone before a single Orc soldier landed. The Custodes, those 10,000 personal guards of the Emperor, maintained their posts, protecting the Emperor specifically, protecting the Golden Throne, because that was their primary function and nothing else mattered to them in comparison, but left the rest of Terra to manage its own crisis. Meanwhile, Corland, the last surviving captain of the shattered Imperial Fists, was essentially running the entire Imperial military response to this crisis on political goodwill and the personal respect that came from being the last son of Dawn. He pulled together an alliance from the disparate successor chapters of the Imperial Fists lineage, a coalition calling itself the Last Wall, and he rebuilt a version of his chapter from their combined ranks. It was a desperate measure, unprecedented in its audacity, potentially illegal under the Codex Astartes. But desperate measures were what the situation called for. The investigation to locate the beast's homeworld was its own odyssey. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in a rare demonstration of either helpfulness or self-preservation instinct, admitted to having experimented with Orc teleportation technology. Using knowledge extracted from a partially mechanized former Orc expert, the location was eventually confirmed. Ulanor, the same world. The world where Horus had thrown Erlac Urg from the Tower of Ulanor 1,500 years ago. A sea where the Emperor had stood on a citadel above a 500-kilometer parade ground and changed the fate of the galaxy by handing his authority to a son who would eventually betray him. The same world that had been Urg's seat of power, that had been designated a trophy world by the Emperor himself, that should by rights have been a monument to imperial triumph. The beast had made it his home, had built his empire on top of the ruins of the one that had been destroyed there before, had specifically, deliberately chosen the location where Orc civilization had suffered its greatest humiliation and raised his palace there, his throne room positioned on the exact coordinates where the Emperor and his Primarchs had stood at the triumph of Ulanor. This was not coincidence, this was a declaration. Hence Part 10. 3 invasions of Ulanor, the War of Survival. The Imperium mounted 3 separate invasions of Ulanor during the War of the Beast. 3. Each one a vast military commitment representing an enormous percentage of the forces the Imperium could actually bring to bear. Each one facing obstacles that the previous one had not fully anticipated, and the cost was catastrophic. The first invasion was led by Vulcan, not the Records Archive version of Vulcan, not a descendant or a successor. The actual Primarch, who had been missing for 10,000 years, had returned, or perhaps more accurately, had been unable to die permanently because he was one of the Perpetuals, the rare humans whose genetic code included an utterly mysterious mechanism for regenerating from even the most total physical destruction. While he had been cycling in and out of death and rebirth for millennia, drifting through the galaxy at the edge of sanity, and now, in the Imperium's most desperate hour, he had returned. Vulcan led the combined forces into Gorkogrod, the Orc capital city, built inside a structure that defied easy categorization, part palace, part gargant, part temple, covering an area large enough that armies could be lost inside it. The Orcs did not fight the way they had fought in previous engagements against the Imperium. They used the terrain. They drew the Imperial forces into kill zones, urban fighting corridors, where the Imperial's advantages in training and equipment were partially offset by the sheer volume of greenskins that the beast's psychic field had made larger and more dangerous than standard Orcs. Every street was a trap, as every building was a fortification. The beast had turned the entire planet into a weapon, and he was firing it at the invaders with patient, strategic precision. Vulcan reached the beast's throne room. He faced the creature that was apparently the most prominent of the 6 Prime Orcs, and they fought, and the Primarch, in order to destroy the entity and the mechanism that powered the conversion of Ulanor into an attack planet, apparently sacrificed himself. The explosion was vast. Resistance collapsed. The Imperial force extracted. Then the message started broadcasting from the surviving attack moon over Terra. I am slaughter. I am slaughter. I am slaughter, repeating on every Imperial frequency. The beast was alive, or another of the 6 beasts was alive, or both. Either way, the work was not done. And the second invasion was built on a different approach. Corland had proposed the formation of what would become the Death Watch, small, elite kill teams, drawn from multiple chapters, specifically designed for the elimination of vital Xenos targets. And for the second attempt on Ulanor, they worked in conjunction with Sisters of Silence and a captured Orc Psyker, aiming to use the Orc's own psychic field against him to reverse the resonance that made the beast what he was and use it to destroy him. The ritual worked. In the moment of its activation, the Prime Orc it targeted died, and then, immediately, a second Prime Orc entered the throne room. even larger, the one who had fought Vulcan in the first invasion, and with it, the Imperial force realized the truth. 6 thrones, 6 banners, 6 prime orcs, and each one commanding a segment of the greatest greenskin force in history, none of them the Beast, but all of them collectively being the Beast. Corlan died in that throne room. The last son of Dawn, who had carried the entire weight of the Imperial Fist's legacy and the leadership of the war effort, was crushed underfoot by the second prime orc as the Imperial forces fled. The Imperium lost its Lord Commander. It retreated from Ulanor a second time. The third invasion was led by Maximus Thane, chapter master of the Fist's Exemplar, who had rebuilt the Imperial Fists from the survivors of the last Wall Coalition, and now led what remained of the Imperium's military will against the Beast for the final time. This time, the approach was less subtle and considerably more apocalyptic. The Imperium redirected asteroids to begin devastating the planet itself, removing the Orcs' ability to use the terrain and forcing a confrontation outside the urban kill zones. And in the chaos of a planet being actively broken apart, another attempt at the psychic ritual, Sisters of Silence, captured Orc Psyker, the accumulated knowledge of every failure that had come before, found the Beast of Beasts, the most dominant of the 6 prime orcs, and killed him. And the others died with him, all of the prime orcs. The vast orc psychic field that had sustained and unified the greatest greenskin invasion in history collapsed all at once, like a system-wide power failure. Without the field, without the beast's psychic dominance pushing every greenskin in his empire to heights of size and aggression and coordination that no orc could maintain on its own, the war of the beast ended. Not cleanly, not instantly. The orc forces scattered across hundreds of worlds took years to mop up, and that mopping up claimed lives in its own right. But the existential threat, the thing that had parked an attack moon over Terra and nearly destroyed the Imperium's heart, was gone. The cost defied easy accounting. The Imperial Fists had been effectively destroyed and rebuilt twice. Space Marine chapters across the galaxy had taken losses from which some would never recover. As the Adeptus Astartes as a whole was so severely diminished that the Death Watch was created not as a luxury, but as a recognition that traditional warfare against Xenos threats of this scale was not reliable, and that something more specialized and more sustainable was needed. Vast swathes of the galaxy had been devastated, billions of Imperial citizens were dead, and all of it traced back to that same world, Ulanor, the world where the Great Crusade had reached its apex, the world where Horus had killed Erlac Urg, and the Emperor had made an announcement that started the Horus heresy, the world where, 1,500 years later, the Beast had built his empire on the bones of the previous one. Part 11, the world that became Armageddon. The aftermath of the War of the Beast contains one of those pieces of lore that, when you trace it to its conclusion, has the quality of a dream in which everything is slightly wrong in a way you cannot immediately identify. After the third invasion of Ulanor, Lord Commander Maximus Thane ordered the Adeptus Mechanicus to perform exterminatus on the planet, to burn it entirely, to reduce it to sterile rock, to ensure that whatever was left on that world, the technological remnants of the most advanced orc civilization ever encountered, the spores from billions of dead greenskins, the ruins of Gorkogrod, and the Temple Gargant at its heart, could never become the seed of another beast, could never be a rallying point for another greenskin crusade, could never again be the origin point of an existential threat to humanity. Fabricator General Kubik of the Adeptus Mechanicus received the order. And then he made a different choice. Because the technologies developed by the Beast's orcs, the attack moon drives, the subspace transit mechanisms, the gravity weapons, the extraordinary materials science involved in the construction of attack moon hulls, the psychic amplification devices, were, by any technical measure, more advanced than anything the Adeptus Mechanicus possessed. Violating multiple restrictions on the use of Xenos technology? Yes. Worth it? Kubik clearly thought so. Instead of exterminatus, The Fabricator General used reverse-engineered Orc teleportation technology, the same technology the Imperium had been using to move attack moons across the galaxy, to teleport Ulanor Prime itself. The entire planet moved through subspace, relocated to a different star system in Segmentum Solar, a system already designated for future colonization. The world's Orc traces were stripped bare over the following years. The tech priests took everything worth taking, and then they left. They reported back to the High Lords of Terror that Ulanor had been destroyed, cast into the nearest blue supergiant. Gone, nothing to see, nothing to worry about. Centuries passed. The uninhabited world in its new star system was eventually found by Imperial colonization surveys, given a new name, settled, developed, and grew over the course of those centuries into one of the most heavily industrialized and heavily defended worlds in the Segmentum Solar. That world is Armageddon, the same Armageddon where, in the 41st millennium, 3 wars of Armageddon would be fought against, of all possible enemies, the Orcs. It's the same Armageddon that became the site of one of the largest continuous military engagements in the history of the late Imperium. A world that the Orcs kept returning to, in force, with a persistence that defied military logic, as though something about that planet was drawing them, as though the spores that had soaked into its soil across 2 separate Orc civilizations spanning 30 million years of species history were still there, still calling, still waiting. They were. Of course they were. The Orcs cannot be removed from a planet by simply killing the Orcs on it. You have to sterilize the soil. And Kubik, in his hunger for Xenos technology, had never done that. He had stripped the planet, moved it, and left it, with its history intact, with its spores intact, which with everything that makes an Orc-infested world an Orc-infested world, still very much present beneath the surface, dormant, waiting for the right conditions. Armageddon. The word is Old Gothic, borrowed from a text even older than the Imperium, a word associated in that text with the site of a final, apocalyptic battle between cosmic forces. The Adeptus Mechanicus, when they chose a cover name for Ulanor Prime after relocating it, either had a dark sense of humor or understood something about that world's future that they never shared with anyone. Part 12. Why these stories matter. Step back from the specific events, from the names and dates and battles, and the specific mechanics of who killed whom, with what, and why. Step back far enough to see the shape of what these stories, together, you tell us about the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and about the nature of the threats within it. The Orcs, taken seriously, are perhaps the most terrifying species the Imperium faces, not because they are subtle, not because they are mysterious, not because they pursue some deep, incomprehensible agenda that requires decades of scholarship to understand. They are terrifying because they are simple. They fight, they grow, they come back. You cannot negotiate with them, cannot redirect their ambitions, cannot offer them something they want more than battle, because what they want more than anything else is battle, and the galaxy provides battle in unlimited quantities. They cannot be wiped out because killing them seeds the ground with their successors. Their dead are their future, and at the extreme end of what the Orc species is capable of, when conditions align for long enough that a single warlord accumulates victories across decades and centuries, when his psychic field begins pulling the whole of his species toward him, when the loop of growth, feeding on more growth, runs long enough without interruption, you get something that looks like Erlac Urg at Ulanor, or Garl Blackfang at Gyros Thravian, or the Beast. Garl Blackfang pushed 3 Primarchs to the edge of defeat, with a horde that the most powerful human in history then had to personally enter battle to break. That fact alone, taken plainly, is a statement about the ceiling of Orc capability that deserves to sit with you, not one Primarch. 3. Horus, Dawn, Mortarion are 3 of the most capable military commanders that will ever exist in human history, and they were losing. Erlac Urg forced the deployment of the largest single military force the Great Crusade ever assembled. 100,000 Space Marines, 8 million Imperial soldiers, 600 warships, and was still only definitively ended when Horus, a Primarch, personally climbed a tower, and fought him in single combat. The story of the Ulanor Crusade is often told as a triumph, and it was a triumph, but it was a triumph that required extraordinary resources and the personal involvement of the finest warrior alive. The margin of victory was smaller than the celebrating afterwards suggested, and the War of the Beast, where an emperor already broken and entombed, unable to act, unable to intervene, had to watch through whatever psychic perception he retained while a moon-sized weapon orbited terror, is something else entirely. The beast was smarter than Urg, more powerful, more dangerous by an order of magnitude that challenged the taxonomic categories that imperial xenobiologists had developed for orc classification. He spoke Gothic. He remembered, in some sense, that a creature of pure instinct should not have been capable of the defeat at Ulanor 1,500 years earlier, and he built his revenge around that memory with a patience and a deliberateness that should have been impossible for an orc. The Imperium barely survived all three of these threats. Barely. At Gyros Thravian, 3 legions were pushed to near collapse before the Emperor's personal intervention saved them. At Ulanor, with the largest military operation in the Crusade's history, was required to bring down a single Warboss, and the War of the Beast killed the last son of Dawn, devastated the Astartes to a degree that required the creation of entirely new institutions to compensate, and came within a poorly timed failure of strategy of ending the Imperium of man entirely. There is something else worth noting here, something that sits at the intersection of lore and the larger themes that Warhammer 40,000 has always been built around. The story of Ulanor is also the story of hubris. The Imperium won the Ulanor Crusade and concluded that the orc race was broken, that the threat had been ended, that the greenskins could never again gather sufficient force to challenge the Imperium's dominance. This conclusion was a comfortable one and a wrong one, and the 1,500 years between the Ulanor Crusade and the War of the Beast is essentially the story of that complacency being allowed to calcify into unexamined certainty. The orcs never stopped. They never do. The species does not have the conceptual framework for stopping. There is no Orc Council of Elders who voted to stand down after Ulanor, no diplomatic channel through which concessions were negotiated, no exhaustion that permanently reduced their capacity for war. The spores sank into the ground. The survivors regrouped. The cycle continued, slow at first, then faster still, until a being that history would struggle to adequately describe sat on a throne built on the ruins of the last great orc empire and declared to anyone in the galaxy who would listen that he was ready. The tragedy is in the certainty. Yes, the Imperium was certain, and certainty in the 40,000 universe is almost always what kills you, not the enemy you are watching, the enemy you stopped watching. In the eternal conflict that defines the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the orcs remain the most numerous xeno species in the galaxy. More numerous than humanity, more numerous than any other intelligent species. They are everywhere, in every corner of the galaxy, in every system where the soil was seeded and the conditions were eventually right. They are, in the language of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the universe's most successful invasive species. They were engineered to be exactly that, and they have been performing to specification for longer than most civilizations have existed. At the question that began this video, has anything come close to actually killing the Emperor, has an answer that is more complicated than a simple yes or no. Garl Blackfang threatened to break the Great Crusade before it achieved its purpose, and an Emperor who had not personally intervened might have watched the finest military operation in human history fail at one of its critical junctures. Erlac Urg's empire, if not met with the full weight of imperial force, and not neutralized by Horus in that throne room at the top of the tower, would have continued to grow, continued to absorb more orcs into its horde, continued to push its warlord to sizes and levels of psychic dominance that could have become genuinely unstoppable. And the beast, with an attack moon in orbit over Terra, and a plan to turn Ulanor into an attack planet and send it through subspace to collide with humanity's homeworld. The beast was, genuinely, within reach of ending the Emperor not through a fight, but through the destruction of the infrastructure keeping him alive. None of them succeeded, but the fact that they came as close as they did, that they required the responses they required, that the cost of stopping them was as high as it was, that tells you something true about the nature of this universe, about the scale of the threats it contains, about the width of the margins that separate the Imperium's survival from its absolute, total, irreversible end. The green tide never stops. The warbosses grow. And somewhere out there, in the darkness between the stars, the spores are sinking into soil. Most the cycle is running, and the next overlord, the next warboss who will force the Imperium to reach into its deepest reserves just to survive the encounter, is getting bigger with every fight. That is the nature of the orc threat in Warhammer 40,000, not a story with an ending, a tide, and tides do not stop. They only recede and wait. If you made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you spending this time with the story. These kinds of deep dives into the corners of 40k lore that do not always get the attention they deserve are what Q on 40,000 is built around, finding the threads that, when you pull on them, unravel into something much larger and much darker than you expected. The story of the orc warbosses who came closest to killing the Emperor is ultimately a story about complacency, about cycles, about the way that victory can contain the seeds of future catastrophe if you are not paying attention to what you left alive. If this kind of calm, unhurried walk through the deep lore is something you enjoy, hitting the subscribe button keeps you in the loop whenever a new one arrives. Leaving a comment with which part of this story hit you hardest, whether that was Garl Blackfang at Gyros Thravian, the triumph of Ulanor and what it set in motion, or the revelation that Ulanor and Armageddon are the same world, that genuinely helps shape what this channel covers next. Take care of yourselves. The Emperor protects, and for the orcs, well, they protect themselves just fine.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.